The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm very pleased to welcome back once again Sylvia to the show. Sylvia, welcome.
Welcome, and thank you for having me again.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and probably should say your full name, Sylvia Barbara Soberton.
Yes.
Today, we're going to talk about a topic that I don't think you and I have discussed on the show, and it's on your book, Medical Downfall of the Tudors, Sex, Reproduction, and Succession. So I'm excited about this topic today. Are you excited to talk about it again?
Yes, definitely.
Well, this is an interesting topic, and I feel like there's always so many questions, but let's just kind of get into it on and begin with what inspired you to do this topic.
hmm So it sounded to me like an obvious title for the book because the Tudors died out as a result of not having a direct male heir who would succeed Elizabeth I. And I thought it's such an interesting angle to look at at the whole dynasty through the lens of their health, their medical records, and the pregnancies of the Tudor queens. So I thought it was a nice, new, fresh perspective on the Tudors. Although, interesting thing is that the Tudors were not the only dynasty in the 16th century that died out as a result of not having a direct male heir. For example, the Valois in France also didn't have male heirs to succeed them. The Jagiellonians in Poland. So very interesting that huge dynasties that existed for okay, the Tudors existed for 103 years, so
Yeah.
not that long, but it's obviously it's not a great thing for them that the dynasty ended without a male heir to carry their legacy into the next generation.
Yes, yeah. And before somebody's going to comment, and I know you just misspoke when you said 103 years, but I think it was actually 118 years
Okay.
that they're. I just,
Okay, because perhaps I got because Elizabeth I died in 1603, and maybe that's
yes,
where I
yeah,
got.
yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
I'm
just,
not very good at mathematician. Not very good mathematician. So
I'm
forgive me
being,
for.
I'm being proactive because I know how finicky sometimes the listeners can
Mm,
be, and they'll jump on that right away. So
okay.
we'll just we'll set that
Okay.
aside now. On
hmm
a recent podcast with Dr. Emma, we talked about poisoning, and
Oh yeah,
I'm not sure if
I
you
listened
listened.
to that.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was going to say, and that's something that you touch base on in your book as well. And if you don't
Yes.
mind, I would like to start there,
Okay.
maybe with Katherine of Aragon, because you write about that in your book as well.
hmm So do we
So,
start with Catherine or do we start with poisons?
well, let's start with poisons. We'll get to
Okay.
Katherine, right?
Okay.
What did you learn in your research about poisons in the Tudor
Mhm.
period?
Okay, so I've learned that at least two Tudor men were said to have been poisoned. So one of the most prominent cases, I guess, would be Edward VI. So Henry VIII's male heir. He succeeded the throne as a 9-year-old boy in 1547, died, I think he was 15 in 1553. And Edward died, it was said, of tuberculosis. And today you will read that in many books, many historical books, that he died of tuberculosis. That was also called consumption back in the Tudor period. That was, anyway, the understanding of his contemporaries. But the symptoms that Edward had confused his doctors. They didn't really know what was happening because tuberculosis usually means that you cough with this dry, hoarse cough, and that you spit out blood and other matter. And Edward had that in the beginning, but then later he started displaying these strange symptoms, like his limbs were swollen, his hair started to fall, his fingernails started to fall out. He had those discolored fingernails, and he was all swelled up. Sores were appearing on his body. So those were not consistent with tuberculosis. And rumors started to appear that he was poisoned. And also, when Henry Fitzroy, Henry VIII's illegitimate son, died unexpectedly in 1536, it was said that he displayed the same symptoms as Edward VI. With Edward, we are lucky because the imperial ambassador reported everything, reported what Edward, how Edward felt, what were his symptoms. He reported exactly from the beginning of the disease until the end. So from April until July, we know quite a lot about Edward's last illness. With Fitzroy, we don't have as much information. We just know that he died from rapid tuberculosis, something like that. So it was also said that tuberculosis was his diagnosis, but because he died so quickly, unexpectedly, and his funeral was also quite hushed up, a quick thing. So rumors appeared that Edward VI and Fitzroy suffered from the same illness. And with Fitzroy, there were rumors of poisoning as well.
Mm.
And Fitzroy died in July. I think it was 22nd, 23rd July, 1536. And the rumors suggested that he was poisoned by Anne Boleyn and her brother. Now, Anne Boleyn, of course, she was executed on 19th of May. So it was not possible for her to administer a poison. But people at that time believed that a slow-working poison could have been administered and cause damage to the health over time. So it was not entirely unreasonable for people to assume that Fitzroy was poisoned. I think that Fitzroy and Edward VI were not poisoned, that they just suffered from something that their doctors struggled to understand at the time. And of course, a natural assumption would be that they were carried off by poison.
Yeah. Okay. So while you were telling this story, it made me think about Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, and she died from consumption as well, didn't she? If I remember. Maybe I'm throwing you off here.
Henry VIII's daughter?
No, his sister, who married
His
Charles
sister.
Brandon.
Yeah, we don't really know what she died of. I was researching like every member of the Tudor dynasty, including Henry VIII's sisters, and I couldn't find any like firm information about the cause of death of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister.
Okay.
I think she was depicted as dying of tuberculosis in the Tudors. So maybe
that's probably where I'm confusing it.
But she was, what I know for sure is that she was sick for several years before she died, because there are references to doctors, to appointments, to her being sick frequently. So she may have died of tuberculosis, but we don't really know what carried her off. It could have been anything, basically.
Okay. Well, and of course, I in my conspiratorial head like to think Edward VI was poisoned by John Dudley.
Oh, because you don't like Dudley too much,
right?
Do you?
No, I don't. Well,
That's not a secret at this point.
It is not a secret. I should just have a T-shirt made that says "I do not like John Dudley."
You probably should. That's a great idea, Rebecca.
Well, it just kind of played right into what I would perceive as his plan. Edward VI died, and look, his daughter-in-law is the heir. His son
becomes queen. His son becomes king. He's royalty now. How convenient.
How convenient. And, and then on the flip side, I have to think of Henry Fitzroy possibly being poisoned by the Seymours, too. So it could go any direction, really. I won't be completely biased.
Okay. I mean, if you like a little conspiracy theory, then yes, of course. And of course, it must be said that when the rumors proliferated, it was said that John Dudley used poison against Edward VI, because, of course, his son was the husband of Jane Grey, who became queen. But really, I think, John Dudley was highly unpopular because he monopolized power. But I don't think it was in his best interest to poison the king at the age of 15. Why would he do that? I don't think so. But, a little conspiracy theory is always something interesting and good to ponder a little bit.
This is why we love the Tudors. It's all the drama, right?
Right. Exactly.
So we have Edward VI possibly poisoned, Henry Fitzroy possibly poisoned. Who do you want to talk about next?
Oh, and when you mentioned Katherine of Aragon earlier, I was like, why would you mention Katherine? And then I'm more like, of course, there were rumors that she was poisoned as well.
Yes.
Yeah, there were rumors, yes, that she was poisoned, and many people at the time seemed to actually believe it. So Chapuis, for example, Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, Catherine's great friend, staunch supporter, he believed that she was poisoned. Um, but I think it's not very reasonable to think so because Catherine, if Henry VIII wanted to poison Catherine or Anne Boleyn wanted to poison her, it was in their best interest to do that earlier when the divorce case was dragging on and it was such a, public embarrassment, international embarrassment, how long that divorce case lasted. It didn't make really much sense to poison Catherine at that point when she was already banished. Her marriage to the king was annulled. She was, from many points of view, inconsequential, not important anymore. An ex-queen in exile, dowager princess of Wales. So I don't think it was, profitable for them to poison her, and that's why I think she died of natural causes. Although the exact cause of her death also remains undiagnosed, because of course we can't diagnose someone who died 500 years ago. We can just look at their symptoms and see if it looks like something we may be familiar with today. But with Catherine, it's really like her illness was so quick, so swift, and I'm not surprised that rumors proliferated that she was poisoned because it, she fell ill in December, and in January she was already dead. So it was about a month. It lasted about a month, and Chapuis believed that she would recover because when he came to visit her, she recovered a little bit. Then when he was leaving her, she was like looking on the mend, and then when he was making his way towards London, she died, and he was informed while he traveled to London, and he was very much surprised, as many people I'm sure were at the time, because she wasn't that old. She was in her 50s. She wasn't that ill. So whatever carried her off to her grave must have been really something very, very fast, perhaps an infection, perhaps, I don't know. I'm not surprised that people thought that it was poison.
Well, and the fact, okay, so where do I go now? I found it really interesting in your book when you talked about how one of the points of conspiracy is that it was, I'm going to forget the title, a misunderstanding or translation of, was it candle maker?
Ah, yeah.
Let's talk about that because I thought that
Okay.
was really interesting that you touched base on that because we always talk about her heart being found black, and then we talk
Mhm.
about who was present at the time of her autopsy, so to speak.
Mhm. So it was about an 8 hours after her death, Henry VIII ordered post-mortem autopsy to learn the cause of Catherine's death. And Chapuis, who reported about it, and we know that because Chapuis wrote about it. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have known. He was outraged that none of the members of Catherine's household were present, and he wrote that not no one was allowed to be present, not even her confessor or physician, but only candle maker of the house and one servant and the companion of the one who opened her. So he was outraged that it was a candle maker. But, and that's important, Chapuis demonstrated that after 7 years at the Tudor court, he still sometimes had problems with English customs because the candle maker who performed the postmortem was no ordinary candle maker, but a member of the wax chandler's company. And their business originally included the making of torches, tapers, and candles, but they were also called in for embalming because the wax chandlers were a minor medical guild. And so Catherine was embalmed and served by the wax chandler, laid in her in a lead um, by the plumber, and then prepared for the burial. So it's not what it looks like at first glance when you read Chapuis's report. Um, but yes, I was quite surprised that Chapuis, after 7 years, didn't know that. So he was outraged, but he shouldn't have been because that was a normal practice into Tudor England.
Yeah, it's funny how one little thing like that can take on a life of its own. I mean, centuries
Exactly.
later, we're still talking about it like, oh, that's suspicious. Why was
Suspicious.
there? Yeah.
Yeah, because it sounds so secretive, right? Like,
Yeah.
why would she be opened by a candle maker? Why would he make an autopsy? Well, because that was customary. So, not
Yeah.
as secretive or insane as we might say. It doesn't sound so crazy
Yeah. I'm
when you
still in,
actually, research it further.
yeah, and I'm glad that you did that.
Thank you.
I'm still so confused about the whole black heart thing. Like, were you able to find any more information on what would cause a black heart?
No, no, because a black heart could have been caused by many things. And, we know only this, that her heart was black. And that while she was ill, she couldn't retain any food. So she presumably had either diarrhea, vomits, or things like that. So it could have been caused by many by many illnesses. Chapuis, I think it was Chapuis who actually says that she drank Welsh beer and that's when she became ill. So maybe she became infected, by yeast. Who knows? But I'm really not surprised, and I'm gonna say that again, that people thought that it was poison because the illness was so quick, and she made a recovery. So it looked suspicious to Chapuis. Of course, Chapuis was very quick to form conclusions, that, oh, yes, that was poison. But to be fair to Chapuis, Catherine's physician, Miguel de la Salle, also believed that she was poisoned.
Mm,
Based on the autopsy, what he saw, he believed she was poisoned, that it was not unreasonable to think that it was poison. So,
yeah.
people who were learned at the time, who knew their thing, who knew their field, like, physician, um, they believed that it was possible. And
Yeah.
certainly many people, repeated that gossip that she was poisoned by in an Italian poison, because of course the Italians were famous poisoners.
Yeah.
And those rumors circulated at the court of Charles V as well. So Henry VIII's ambassador had to say that it's not really the case, that she died because she was ill, not because she was poisoned. And I don't think that Charles believed it. I think if he believed it, he would have acted upon that belief and perhaps make war on England. But I don't think that he believed so.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting. And, in Dr. Emma's episode, she talks about how Catherine seemed a little paranoid about being poisoned and she had her
Mhm.
meals fixed in her room. So there clearly was already rumors going around about her being poisoned. So that just kind of feeds into this story even more, doesn't it?
Yes, she definitely believed she might be poisoned because that was in the beginning of her banishment from court. She believed that Henry VIII, in order to marry Anne Boleyn and to legitimize that union with her, would poison Catherine or murder her or do whatever he would to just get rid of her. Because Catherine wasn't stupid, of course. As long as she was alive, Henry VIII was not able to marry another woman.
Mm.
So he did that anyway. And, he had two wives, basically.
Yeah,
Because, of
exactly.
course, the divorce, as we today know it, as we talked about in the episode when I was talking about my book, Marriage Tudor Style, that the divorce, in our understanding of the word, didn't really exist in Tudor England.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think this is the perfect transition to move to Anne Boleyn. Of course,
Okay.
everybody's favorite gateway queen when it
Mm.
comes to the
Oh, yes.
Tudors. You write a lot about her pregnancies,
Mhm.
and I found it very fascinating. And let's just start with that, I guess. Let's talk about the 1534 pregnancy because
Okay.
that's the one that's shrouded in the most mystery, right? Because we know
Mhm.
she had Elizabeth in 1533,
Yes.
and then she had this 1534 pregnancy that the medal was struck of
Mhm.
her, the only contemporary image that we definitely have of Anne Boleyn.
Mhm.
But what
Yes.
happened, right? That's the question. Let's
Mhm.
talk about that pregnancy and what you discovered in your research.
Mhm. So Anne Boleyn gave birth to Elizabeth on 7th September 1533. And then in January of 1534, we have rumors that she's pregnant again. So she must have been early in her pregnancy. that those rumors were already proliferating. And we know that she was pregnant until June or July, because many reports circulate that she has a fair belly, a big belly, and people are praying for the prince. So she must have been visibly pregnant in order for people to make those comments. And in the summer of 1533, she disappears from the record. She's on the progress with Henry VIII. She disappears from the record. She emerges again in September, and she's no longer pregnant. Then again, our good friend Chapuis says, well, the king entertained suspicions that his lady was no longer pregnant. And this led medical historian John Dewhurst to form a theory that Anne suffered from a phantom pregnancy. Phantom pregnancy would be when you looked pregnant, you felt pregnant, but you were not really pregnant. So distended belly, breasts emitting milk, stoppage of menstrual courses, menstruation. But for example, Eric Ives, Anne's biographer, didn't believe that she suffered from phantom pregnancy because she just had given birth to a healthy baby girl. And why would she be so scared to not be able to produce another child? And I think he's right. The key to discovering what happened to Anne in the summer of 1534 is in the interrogation of one woman called Margaret Chancellor, who was interrogated on her words about Queen Anne. Anne was highly unpopular. Many people talked about her as being a usurper, as being a whore, a harlot, who the devil made Anne queen, and stuff like that. And Margaret Chancellor is one of those people. And she's interrogated. And she said, among other things, that the queen had one child dead born by the king, and that she prayed she would never have another. And that the timing is also interesting because it's 6 months after what happened to Anne Boleyn in the summer. I think it's in February 1535 when Margaret Chancellor is examined. And, only 6 months later after whatever happened to Anne Boleyn. And I think that it must be interpreted as that people knew, the rumors spread that Anne Boleyn had given birth to a stillborn child in the summer of 1534. Sadly, we don't know the sex of the baby. Could have been a boy, could have been a girl. We just don't know. We can speculate, but, futile, because we won't know probably at this point. But I think there is this even evidence to me sounds very compelling that it was a stillbirth and that Anne recovered. She was recovering far away from the prying eyes of the court, probably at Guildford Castle. I talked about that in greater detail in the book. And she emerged again in September of 1534 after the royal progress, and she was no longer pregnant. So Chapuis wasn't really, probably, maybe he knew, but it wasn't in his best interest to say, she had a stillbirth. So it sounded probably better if he said, well, the king thinks she's no longer pregnant, because she wasn't pregnant at that point anymore. But I think Henry obviously knew what happened. And if the rumors proliferated about a stillbirth, others must have known as well. We hear the echoes of what happened, but we don't really know what happened. But I think the presented evidence is quite compelling to me that it was a stillbirth, sadly.
Yeah. I'd never heard that before until your book. So I find that really interesting. And this just made me think of something. And I don't know if you know the answer to this or not. But when there was a stillbirth and it was early like that, did the woman still have to go through the churching process?
I think so, yes, because she still had given birth to a child. She still went through a process of labor. So she still had to go through the churching, yes.
Okay, so
But she wouldn't take to her chamber because taking to her chamber was a very ceremonial way of the queen leaving the society very, very publicly, very symbolically, and she would emerge as the mother of the child, preferably mother of the male heir. But in Anne's case, we don't have any evidence that she took to her chamber. So the outcome of her pregnancy, the labor must have been unexpected, surprising. But she would have gone through the churching because she still had given birth. It was a stillbirth, but the process happened, so she was still considered unclean because the churching was the biblical way of telling women that after giving birth you're unclean and you should be purified. So yeah.
Yeah. I also find it interesting that we know so much about Catherine of Aragon's pregnancies. And I feel like why do you think it is that Anne Boleyn and this maybe pregnancy in particular seems so shrouded in mystery by comparison?
Mm-hmm. Because I think with Anne's pregnancies were as important as Catherine's, right? Because she was expected to give birth to a male heir because Henry VIII didn't have a legitimate son, and Henry VIII expected Anne to have his son as soon as possible. And so it was very important for Anne to produce a son. And I think because we don't know what really happened in 1534, as I said, we just hear the echoes of what happened. I think we would like to have definitive answers. Maybe that would be easier for us to understand why Henry VIII made the decision in the end to get rid of Anne, because in his own worldview, in his mind, she was no longer able to give him a son because she had a daughter, then a stillbirth, possibly a son. Perhaps Henry believed that history was repeating itself with Anne, as it was with Catherine, that, is my marriage to Anne cursed? Like it was, like he believed it was cursed with Catherine, because, Henry VIII was bedding Anne's sister, and Katherine of Aragon was married previously to Henry VIII's brother, so the degrees of affinity were the same here. So it's not surprising that he would think that history is repeating itself again.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So that's Anne Boleyn.
But at the same time, I'm just going to say it because I think that many people also have many misconceptions about Catherine of Aragon's pregnancies because we think we know so much about them. But when we actually start to research, it's not what we think. Or at least in my case, when I was researching, I usually read that Catherine had multiple or numerous miscarriages. So when I started researching this book, I saw in the record that that's not really the case, that I could find only one possible miscarriage in Catherine's case, but it was she usually gave birth to stillborn children. She had like this. She was usually giving birth prematurely, like a month before her due date. So I think it's very interesting, and I think the narrative in Catherine's case also should be kind of rewritten because she didn't suffer from numerous miscarriages. She had 3 stillbirths, 2 live births, and 1 possible miscarriage reported by, the pregnancy reported by Wolsey. I think it was in September of 1511 when he said that the queen is thought to be pregnant, but then nobody reports anything. So this could have been a miscarriage, or it could have been the case when she was not pregnant at all, that people thought that she was, but she wasn't.
Yeah, this makes me wonder now that you mention that, when we talk about miscarriages and we talk about pregnancy in the Tudor era, pregnancies weren't usually determined until the child stirred within the mother's womb, right? And I would suspect that most miscarriages would happen prior to that point. Yes. So I guess it's no wonder that maybe there isn't any documentation of it.
Yes. So it is, of course, possible that Catherine of Aragon had miscarriages that were not recorded.
Yeah.
But, I'm referring to the record that we have. So the 6 pregnancies that were mentioned on record. And based on that, we can't say that she had multiple miscarriages because the record says that she had stillbirths, that her children were dying as infants. So not really miscarriages, but I'm not surprised that this is said because, history was written until very recently by men, and men don't differentiate between a miscarriage or a stillbirth. And to be fair to male historians who were writing in the past, people who were writing about it as it was happening also didn't often differentiate. So chroniclers, male writers, they would often say, oh, she had a miscarriage, or she had given birth to a dead child. that would be stillborn child. So not very surprising, but I was surprised when I was researching that I found just one possible miscarriage, because we don't have a follow-up on what happened to that pregnancy, whether it was a pregnancy or maybe Wolsey was mistaken, maybe he was reported rumors. Yeah. So it's interesting, like we think we know, but after we delve into it, it's not really the case.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm intrigued by Jane Seymour. Can we talk about
Mm,
Jane Seymour?
yes, definitely. Let's do it.
Okay. You start. You start wherever you want to with Jane because I have questions, but I want to see what you're interested in talking about Jane Seymour first.
Mhm. Oh, okay. So Jane Seymour gave birth to Henry VIII's legitimate son, Prince Edward, on 12th of October, 1537. And she died very sadly, she died just 2 weeks later of childbirth complications. And it was later said by Henry VIII's detractors, by people who wanted to, show him, depict him as this bloodthirsty monster, that he ordered Jane to be cut open. So he ordered a C-section, cesarean operation, so that he could save the child and not Jane. Like, I don't care about the wife, just save my child. But this is not really what happened, because in 16th century, the cesarean operation or the C-section was not performed for the same reasons as we would have it today. So today, a C-section is performed to save both mother and the child. So if you can't give birth naturally, something happens, you get a C-section. I had a C-section with my first child. And in the 16th century, the difference was that it was such a dangerous procedure, and it was doomed to fail, basically. You couldn't survive it in the 16th century. And it was performed to, when the mother was clearly dying or already dead, it was performed to save the baby. So if Jane had a C-section, she would have either died of hemorrhage, she would bled out to death, or she would have had an infection, because people at that time did not know how important it was to have clean hands, or, disinfecting stuff. Also, they didn't know about that. So she would have died almost instantly from the C-section.
Yeah. Yeah. So we know that wasn't the case.
We know that wasn't the case, but at the same time, I was surprised again to learn that there was one C-section in Tudor England. I mean, maybe there were more, but I know of one that was recorded,
Oh.
and it was performed on a woman who served as maid of honor at court. She served Jane Seymour and she served Anne Boleyn, and her name was Bessie Holland. It may ring a bell because she was a mistress of Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk.
Yeah.
And she was his mistress from approximately 1527 to 1546, so until Norfolk was arrested for treason. Now, Bessie was unmarried. She was Norfolk's mistress for many years. They didn't have children. And she testified against him. Her testimony helped to build a case against Norfolk and his son, the Earl of Surrey. Surrey was executed, but Norfolk escaped death because Henry VIII died before he could sign his death warrant.
Lucky.
Lucky. But Bessie, so Norfolk spent his many years in the Tower of London because Edward VI didn't want to start his reign with execution. So he was rotting in the Tower, and Bessie made a life for herself. She left court. She married to a man named Henry VIII. At some point, and that's very intriguing as well, she owned Anne Boleyn's Book of Hours because her name and the name of her husband appear in that Book of Hours. And the connection here is very interesting because she served as maid of honor to Anne Boleyn.
Yeah.
So who knows why? Why did she have it? But that's another story. So she married Henry VIII, and at some point she gave birth to his child, and she died while in childbirth. And we have a very detailed letter about what happened in her birthing chamber. She was cut open, as the letter says. And the physicians and the midwives that attended her, they were not of the same mind about the operation. One physician said it must be performed, other said absolutely not, because it was so controversial. And she was allegedly dead when they were performing, or almost dead. It was clear that she wouldn't make it. And the baby sadly passed away as well. But it was important from the legal point of view, because if the baby survived, her husband could inherit whatever Bessie had, so her lands, in the name of the child. So even if the baby lived for just a few hours, Henry, the husband, would have been entitled to Bessie's lands. So the dispute kind of raged, went on. Why was the baby alive? Was she dead when the operation was performed? But I found that intriguing that we have this recorded, that a C-section was performed on a woman, on a Tudor woman, but she didn't make it. She died, and she was possibly dead at the time of the operation.
Yeah, so there's no way that Jane Seymour would have had a
No.
C-section and survived 12 days.
Definitely not. No, definitely not. No, it must have been something else connected to the childbirth, because she was in labor for 2 days. So that's a long time to be in labor. And it must have been a difficult labor. Later in Edward's life, it was said that he had one shoulder higher than the other.
Oh.
So that may be, perhaps that was the result of him being pulled out of Jane's body. But at the same time, it was also said that Edward Seymour, so Edward's uncle and Jane's brother, had also one shoulder higher than the other. So perhaps it was hereditary trait. So I think that, childbirth was so dangerous. I can't imagine Tudor woman laboring without painkillers, without modern knowledge about the germs and how dirty hands were dangerous for you when you were in labor, because a midwife would sometimes, often, insert her hand inside to feel where the child was lying, whether it was a breech position, whether the head was coming out or not. And if the hand was dirty, it was almost sure that dirty hand can cause infection. And in many cases, it was the case. The doctor in the 19th century, Ignaz Semmelweis, who said that you have to wash your hands. You can't just come up from the morgue and touch a pregnant woman or a woman in labor and expect her to survive. He was laughed at. He was ridiculed for this. Can you imagine?
No.
He was saying something that seems so obvious to us today, and he was ridiculed for it. Unbelievable.
Yes. I just cannot wrap my head around, and I'm going to bring Katherine Parr into this conversation. Jane Seymour lasted for 12 days.
12 days.
Katherine Parr lasted for like 5 days after giving birth. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a medical doctor. I guess I don't know any medical doctors to ask, but how can one woman die so quickly from childbed fever and one last so much longer?
Well, I guess it depends on many things. I think it would depend on how healthy you were overall, how quickly the fever was progressing, which parts of the body were failing you. So I think there were many, many, many things to consider here when we talk about, because, today it's also one person can suffer from the same illness, but the outcome is different. Someone dies, of disease, similar disease, faster than someone else. So I think it depends on many factors, but I think that one thing that we can agree on is that childbed fever was very dangerous. Once you knew you have it, I think the reality dawned on you that you're not going to make it. And it was probably the worst death to die of as a woman back then.
Yeah, it's just so tragic. Whenever I think about both of those women, and of course, I think of Thomas Seymour, right? Because his sister dies from it, and then his wife does too.
Yeah.
I honestly think that he had to have known when Catherine started becoming ill that this
Mhm.
isn't good. My sister died from this.
Mhm.
This seems very similar to that, and the outcome's not. I can't imagine what that would have felt like, even for him.
Very difficult for sure.
Yeah, you have no control over it. There's nothing you can do. This person is going to die.
Hmm.
It's just
Yeah,
terrible. It's just
terrible.
terrible. Yeah, and then of course we have people like Henry VIII who seem to like live forever. And but Henry had his own medical issues, didn't he? I want to talk a little bit about Henry and some of the issues that he had.
Hmm. So yeah, Henry VIII, he died in his 50s, so he wasn't that old. He could have lived longer, but I think that to say with certainty what illness killed him, I'm not gonna tell you because I don't know. I can speculate, but I don't know. I can say for sure that his health started to deteriorate from the moment he suffered an accident in January of 1536. He fell from his horse. He was, in armor. The horse was in armor, and his leg got injured. And from that point on, the leg was covered in fistulas, ulcers. That leg was causing serious problems to Henry VIII. And he said later in his life that he had the worst legs in the world. And
Yeah.
that was probably true. So he limped. He was also grossly overweight. So, put that two and two together, and you will have somebody who is almost unable to walk. And towards the end of his life, he was carried in a chair. So unable to walk. That must have been very difficult for Henry VIII, who was very athletic in his youth, who was a sportsman, who was a jouster. So at the end, he was kind of reliving his youth by looking at other young gallants, jousting and doing all of the things that he did when he was young. Henry VIII took a great interest in his own health and in the health of people around him. For example, when the sweating sickness was raging in 1528, we have evidence that he was um, coming up with his own medicines. So, a bit of a physician there. I don't know how effective his medicines would have been, but nobody would have told him that your medicines suck
Yeah,
because
don't
we
take
were
these.
afraid of him. So just take whatever he gives you and pretend it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What more? Henry, he had his own book of like medicines and recipes of various things applied to various parts of his body. Interestingly, there are some indications that he was making ointments for his member. That may refer to penis because member, right? But that may have been also member, like a part of your body,
Hmm.
members of your body. Also in that understanding. I found it interesting that he came up with an ointment for an inflamed member. You
Hmm.
know what that means? Maybe he had some problems there.
So many questions.
When I was researching that, I was quite surprised that that it's there and it's in this manuscript in the British Library, and that not many people talk about it. It's definitely worth researching more. Maybe I will in at some point in the future.
Yeah.
I just find it so interesting that we have so many interesting things in there, like, curing his member and whatnot. And what does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. What does member mean? Yeah, that's it. I had never heard that before, so that's really
Yeah,
interesting.
I that book was like a well of surprises for me.
I can only
I
imagine.
was learning and discovering so many things about the Tudors that I didn't know before. And it's really interesting to research their lives from the medical records because it really gives you a whole other picture of who they were. And I think it brings us today closer to them, because after all, they were only humans, they were only people
Yeah.
living their best lives, just trying to survive whatever illnesses were happening at the time, smallpox, sweating sickness, measles, influenza, flu, childbirth,
Yeah.
you
Plague.
know. Yeah. So, I really like to research them from that point of view, and I think it's interesting to see that people who were so wealthy, because we are talking about royalty, aristocrats here, could have been so ill, because Henry VIII, um, he afforded the best medical care in the world. In his world, he was having the best doctors, the best cures, and still he died quite young. I think he was 55, or 52.
Yeah, I don't remember
Again,
off the
not a
top of my head.
mathematician.
He was in his
But
50s.
in his 50s. So I think he could have lived a little bit longer. Um, but he didn't, because whatever killed him, um, there are various theories that he may have had diabetes, that he may have had maybe an infection. I think the most likely explanation to me personally is that he had some sort of an infection from his leg, and that he suffered from sepsis as a result. Um, because his last illness was also quite quick, and he just one day he just didn't feel very well, and he died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting too because, we talk about Henry VIII in his youth and how he liked to show off his muscular
Mhm.
calves, right? And
Yes.
and then he has this jousting accident
Yeah.
and now he's got issues with his legs. He's not as mobile. I do really think, and again, I'm not a medical doctor, but I really do think that he probably suffered from diabetes. And
Could have
that's
been, yes.
and that's why the wounds on his legs did not
Didn't
heal.
heal.
And so it would be no surprise that he had an infection and he could have died from the infection as
I
well.
mean, the doctors kept those fistulas opened.
Yeah.
So, that's a recipe for disaster, because it can cause an infection. So you might think that the best medical care would make you live longer, but in Henry's case, I think it actually shortened his days.
Yeah. Yeah. So the jousting accident was at the beginning of 1536. He married Jane Seymour mid
Mhm.
1536. We
Oh,
know what happened to her. He had the accident. He already had maybe some leg issues, and then he marries Anne of Cleves.
oh.
I love your reaction. Oh, and we know how that marriage turned out. But Henry was so adamant to get out of this marriage
Mhm.
that he made it all about Anne, right?
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like. Like she was just disgusting, and
Yeah, I
he
wasn't attracted to her and
yeah.
that kind of thing. Yeah.
Clearly, he's like I couldn't perform my duties because but
Because she's not attractive enough, right?
I don't want
I
to talk
mean,
about this, but I do want to talk about this
let's
because
do talk about it.
let's talk about it because who did he think he was?
Right? Okay, so the Anne of Cleves episode. I mean, I can tell you, I'm so angry at Henry D that he portrayed Anne of Cleves as this ugly, unwanted bride, when in reality she was very pretty. If you look at the portrait that is now in the Louvre, she was a good-looking woman. She wasn't ugly in any sense of the word. Um, Henry VIII, of course. Okay, I have to mention Anne Boleyn again, because during her trial, it came out that Henry VIII may have suffered from impotence.
Hmm.
And Jane Seymour was very unlucky in that she married Henry VIII after those rumors about impotence were proliferating, because she now had to become pregnant very fast
Yeah.
in order to prove to the entire world that no, Henry VIII is not impotent. He is very much virile and manly man. He's able to sire a male heir.
Yeah.
And Henry VIII imagined that Jane should have become pregnant very quickly after their wedding. And like within weeks, he was complaining that she's not yet pregnant. What's happening? Maybe I should have married someone else. And, it was a scary time for Jane Seymour, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, but Jane became pregnant within 8 months after the wedding. So it was quite quick. I would say it wasn't, dragging, the time wasn't dragging with her. But okay, Jane dies, and then Henry VIII marries Anne of Cleves, and for some reason he's unable to perform his marriage duty, or at least that's what Henry says, because there's the German point of view, research by Heather Darcy, whom you know very well.
Yes, yes.
And I find her research very fascinating because she uncovered the letters written in German, of course, where Anne of Cleves actually says that she might be pregnant, that her marriage is consummated, that she would rather die than admit that her marriage was not consummated. But eventually she agrees to an annulment because she knows that's in her best interest,
Yeah.
because otherwise what might happen to her? And she pretends to the whole world that, yes, I was a virgin. She says in a letter to her brother that that her marriage to the king was not consummated and that she's still a virgin, all that thing. And she wanted to be perceived as such, because if the king annuls their marriage based on non-consummation, then she's a virgin, and that was good for her because she could have been contracted in marriage by someone else. So she didn't, so to say, lose her price on the marriage market because she was still a virgin. But it's a question whether that was really the case, because if Henry VIII said that, well, I felt that I can't consummate the marriage, she's not attractive enough, and she says, yes, we slept together, we had sex, I think I'm pregnant, then somebody is lying here.
Right. Oh,
So is it
Henry.
Henry VIII who's lying? I'm not surprised to think, I don't think that it's surprising that he would have had erectile problems.
Mm-hmm.
I think at that point, his leg was, making him immobile. He wasn't able, perhaps, to perform his duties as a husband, but he didn't want it to be perceived as the guilty party. And he, tells his doctor, "Oh, I had wet dreams. I'm able to perform sex, just not with her," and stuff like that. But yeah, I think that those two different versions, so English version and the German version, are so different. You can't have sex and not have sex at the same time. So it's, either you have it or you don't. But I think Anne was smart enough to understand that Henry VIII didn't want her anymore, that she should just, move on and agree to whatever he wanted her to agree. And, she had a really good deal out of it. She was very wealthy. She lived in splendid castles and palaces, had all the money in the world. So, she was better off without him.
Most definitely. And I have to just reiterate again that if Henry VIII was diabetic, this would have also contributed to any erectile dysfunction issues.
Yes,
So
for sure, yeah.
I think it's pretty likely. I would love to see. Has anybody done research on whether or not how would they know? But has anybody done research?
Yeah, at this point, I think we can only speculate because unless maybe we make, examination of his skeletal remains, maybe this would yield new information, but I don't think it's likely to happen anytime soon. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But it's really difficult to diagnose someone with an illness because many symptoms match different illnesses, and we can only speculate. But in Henry's case, yes, the diabetes diagnosis sounds like likely diagnosis. So it's not impossible that he died of that. But at the same time, we will probably never know for sure. So let's speculate.
Yes, we shall. Sylvia, I love having these discussions with you. And I want people to go out and buy this book because it is fascinating. And if anybody would like to learn more about this topic, where can they find your book?
You can find my book on Amazon. It's available as paperback. and as ebook as well. It's in bookshops as well. So wherever you get your books, however you like them, it's out there. Find it, read it. Let me know what you think. Review it. Yeah.
Yes, definitely review it. And I will include links in the show notes to
Thank you.
Amazon for sure so that people can be directed right to the book and make that
Yeah.
purchase. Sylvia, thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking about the medical downfall of the Tudors with me.
Well, thank you so much for having me again, Rebecca. It was such a pleasure.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tutorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.